Real quick, if you're a fan of my Twitch streams or just like adorable Tanuki in general, I just dropped my new VTuber plush over on Makeship. If you want to grab one for yourself, you've got about 20 days to pick one up, and we gotta sell at least 200 for them to be made. So get yourself a new Snuggle Buddy, but be careful, he's got a gun! Don't worry though, it just velcros on and off. Link in the description of where you can get it. So, do y'all know Super Eye Patch Wolf? I've been watching a lot of his stuff lately, and whenever I do, half the time I feel really inspired to add something to the conversation. His video on the dark side of content creation being one of my favorites that, God, it hits so hard, and there's a lot I want to add to that conversation. However, he did one almost a year ago called Horror in Impossible Places, Liminal Spaces in the Backrooms. Eyepatch Wolf isn't the first guy to define liminal spaces, but the way he defines them is the most decorated but coherent that I've ever heard.
Transitory emptiness, uncanny nostalgia, and a surreal, artificial, or dreamlike quality. These to me are the three pillars of liminal imagery, and any liminal space is likely going to have one or more of these qualities.
This is an experience that I think everyone's felt before. A picture or a real-life location that just makes you feel kinda off. Sometimes in a good way, as liminal spaces have been described as transitory places of freedom. Locations with no past or identity, but an infinite present undefined by anything. And they can also be highly nostalgic, with even just one image giving dozens if not hundreds of people a sense of deja vu based on their perceived past. But there's another side of liminal spaces that evoke discomfort and even fear. An uncanny valley effect on a universal scale, where the lack of living things, identification, or even basic sense makes us feel trapped, lost, or overwhelmed. It's hard to describe in detail, but as Eyepatch Wolf said, the defining characteristics of liminal spaces are transitory emptiness, a dreamlike state of existence, and uncanny nostalgia. Now, before I go any further, I don't want people thinking that I'm purely trying to piggyback off of Eyepatch Wolf, especially considering much of the music he used in his video I want to use here. Eyepatch Wolf's videos have been insanely inspirational to a few future videos that I really want to do. And if John is the same final gamer I met back in MagFest of 2020, I think he'll understand that this is coming from a place of shared love. So, in the wake of that video and my own curious interest in liminal spaces, I want to propose a somewhat radical observation. Japan, as a country, is a liminal space. Now, before I get too crazy with this, I do want to clarify that liminal spaces are highly subjective, especially considering just how much the feeling of liminal spaces comes from nostalgia. So, let me say right now that what might be liminal to me might not be liminal for you. But do me a favor, have a look at this image. Now this one. And finally, this one. Which of these images are real? Well, the answer is all of them, and all of them came from Japan. And you might be thinking, oh well, sure Gaijin, a lot of places like this feel liminal, but they're still real and believable. This was the moment that I realized just how liminal Japan can be. In my last trip to Japan late one night, I saw this pole sticking out in the middle of a street, and it just made no sense. The street itself is marked and painted for cars, a bar to make them stop, and curved bars around to denote sidewalks. But in the middle of this little intersection, there was this pole. And it not only freaked me the heck out, but it freaked out Aki too. We thought that we were either going crazy or we were in some kind of dream, because why? Why would this be here? It didn't make sense for it to be here. And that's what gives Japan its inner sense of liminality. When I first went to Japan studying abroad, everything around me felt wrong. Having come from a country where space is ample and you need a car to get everywhere, my senses were overwhelmed during my first couple of weeks around Yokohama. Everything feels equal parts crammed together and never ending. A drugstore on top of a grocer on top of a manga store on top of a clothing store on top of a cafe. And no, this isn't a department store like Aeon that I'm talking about. I mean, it's a dense packing of shops back to back and floor to ceiling. And the reason for this is because due to Japan's limited size, it's not built long like the US, but tall, with shops and homes standing on top of and within reaching distance of each other. Even when compared to really dense cities like New York or LA, two places I have actually been to, Japan has an urban development pattern that is just bizarre to an American mind. It's like there's not a single boundary to anything. And then once you go inside some of these buildings, your senses are double slammed because aisles and walking spaces are so small that they barely fit one lane of foot traffic. And then once you get out of that building, you see the streets, and even those throw you. Supposedly double-lane roads barely fit a single K car, and as you walk along trying to dodge traffic, It's so easy to get lost because the streets are so windy, claustrophobic, and often are lacking in landmarks and name signs. Let me put it this way. When I actually moved to Japan and lived out in Komono, despite it being an Inaka town full of retirees, the first time I tried walking to the school that I worked at, which was only 5 minutes away, I got lost for over an hour because I was so overwhelmed at how many houses, shops, winding, poorly identified streets, and well, everything was just crammed in on itself. For my first few days, I felt scared to leave my own apartment because I felt like everywhere I turned, I couldn't recognize where I was. It was so overwhelming to my senses that it felt like I was in a pocket of nowhere. Part of what defines liminal space is intent. When you enter a space, you understand what it's intended to do or be, and then you behave accordingly. It's what's known as schema theory. I sense something, I pay attention to it, I recall information about it from memory, I activate an adequate schema to identify it, and then I respond to it. But from an American perspective, the densely claustrophobic nature of urban Japan throws the schema theory for a loop. For example, I sense a building, I attempt to pay attention to what kind of building it is, but as I look around, it's a building comprised of different floors with greatly differing stores. I can't easily recall information from my episodic or semantic memory, and then I struggle to activate the schema, and thus my response is muddled and broken and I feel utter confusion in the place that I'm in. Like I said, I attribute this mental response to my upbringing in the US where land is more open and abundant. It's so much easier to identify different buildings as what they are supposed to be. But when you go to Japan and you see everything crammed, packed together, your senses go into a panic mode because you can't differentiate the things that you're seeing. And because of that, it all blurs together, and then everything that is around you quickly becomes nothing and you just get lost in your own senses. But that's only the first way, in my opinion, that Japan is really liminal. Let's talk about one major rule break about liminal spaces that I think Japan actually pulls off. Japan is the only country where I felt a liminal space within a group of people. I know, but let me explain. First, let's talk about Japan's population and perceived homogeny. Japan is a country near the size of California with 125.7 million people in it. Now, while an individual or group of people in a liminal space can suck out that eerie feeling of transitory emptiness, what happens when every square inch of your surroundings is yet another person with light skin and dark hair all going in the same direction? Now, I do not say this to sound inconsiderate or prejudiced. The fact of the matter is that most of Japan's population is made up of Asian people with dark hair, usually black, especially if they're in school or a conformist work environment that demand that they have that hair color. Yes, that actually happens. This is just how Japan is when it comes to its demographics. And there's nothing wrong with that. So with my definitions clear, let me get back to my point. To an American like myself, having grown up in and around a myriad of shapes, sizes, and colors of people, when I was in Japan for the first time, it was so incredibly disorienting for me to not only traverse the near maze-like layout of urban Japan cities and train stations, but when it's filled with a sea of people in similar salaryman suits and short, dark-colored haircuts, all moving in similar directions, it felt really jarring. And for the longest time, I sat here thinking to myself, is it because I really do think everyone looks the same, or is there something else going on here? Because I met people, I made friends, and I soon was able to identify people for who they actually were and find all the subtle differences that made everyone different. But time and time again, I still couldn't escape that liminal feeling when being surrounded by a ton of people. So while writing and researching this script, I sat on that question as to why I felt that way. I mean, back in places like New York or LA when there were tons of people around, I would never have that liminal space feeling. So was it really the fact that I was just surrounded by so many similar looking people, or was there something else? And that's when I discovered French anthropologist Marc Gougier. In his book, Non-Places, Introduction to an Anthropology of Supermodernity, he opens up the idea of the difference between places and non-places. Non-places refer to, quote, anthropological spaces of transience where human beings remain anonymous and that do not hold enough significance to be regarded as places. Examples include hotel rooms, airports, malls, roads, subways, bus stops, and so on, traditionally very liminal locations. They're places that neither remember you nor do you remember them. They don't really have any identity for you to impose on, nor do they impose any identity onto you. They're places where we just exist, sometimes in vast numbers in the case of an airport or a subway, only to move through them without thought. They're not places in which we live or dwell in for long periods of time. And any extended period of time in them makes us feel uneasy or lonely. I mean, for anyone who had a layover that had you spending the night in an airport terminal, you understand how uncomfortable and liminal it feels to try and sleep in a place like that. The antithesis of this are places. These are places that empower identity and enforce the ability for people to come together and share common social references. This could be a club, a bar, a tabletop shop, a sports area, a restaurant. It's any place where people can gather together in order to reinforce their own identity and share that identity with others. Now, this of course is not to say that Japan is lacking in anthropological places. However, in my experience, not only is Japan second to none when it comes to the regular availability and sheer number of non-places in the form of public transportation, it is one of the world's greatest users of the largest form of non-places: train stations. While we in the US favor cars, and Europe and much of East Asia relies on bus systems, Japan's dominant choice of public transportation are trains. Why does this matter? Space. Bus stops, for example, don't require a lot of space. They could be as small as a bench and a sign, but rarely get as big as a medium-sized building with a ticket counter and a waiting room. This can elicit a feeling of non-place, but as many of them are open air, they lack compact and entrapping feelings on an individual. Trains and subways, though, require much larger amounts of space and are much more fully enclosed. Combine that with the fact that Japan has 8,567 stations, they can feel omnipresent in the country. Add on to the fact that when it comes to mid to larger cities in Japan, multiple different shopping outlets are directly attached to the station either above or below ground, only adding to their square footage of these non-places that both lack their own identity and don't enforce their own onto us. I remember every single time I went to Nagoya Station, I just felt lost all the time. Not only was there a regular train up above, but there were subways below, and even below that were a whole myriad maze of just different shopping areas. Heck, there was actually a real-life instance of complete terror, because when I had a friend come to visit me and we were trying to find their stuff in Nagoya Station, we couldn't remember which of the dozens of coin lockers we used. Due to the fact that everything was so crammed together, yet big at the same time, and completely lacking in really big landmarks, we were just lost. Thankfully, after an hour, we did find their stuff and they did get their Shinkansen back to where they were supposed to be going. So when you combine all of that liminal space so densely packed all over Japan with a society that puts priority on uniformity of appearance, it's no wonder why in Japan, even when you're around a ton of different living, breathing people, it can still feel like a liminal space. But all that being said, over time during my months studying and years working in Japan, things became more familiar. Stores and layouts became more familiar and recognizable, my senses grew accustomed to the tight and cramped layouts of different stores and streets, and I was also beginning to meet a lot of new people and recognizing familiar faces. And throughout that, I became more and more familiar with the actually greatly varied differences in style and attire with people in Japan, allowing my brain to correctly formulate proper schema to identify locations and people. Even when I returned home from JET, I would go back to Japan on several trips over the years, and that familiarity with subtleties and the usual sensory overloading people, places, and things stayed with me. But then COVID happened, and this is where the liminal pillar of nostalgia took control. Something that happens with me between my trips to and from Japan is the feeling of multiple existences. Because of how different the US and Japan are in everything from food to people to architecture to population density to culture to social expectations, it feels like a completely different place of existence. And whenever I leave one to go to the other, the existence I left is in a sort of suspended isolation. It's really hard for me to explain, like the transition from going from one form of regularity to another is just that drastic. What I didn't realize though was that over the course of 7 years of constant back and forth travel between the US and Japan, I was creating a subconscious fluctuation of perception of existence, isolating and subconsciously forgetting one, quote, life so to speak, and moving on to another and then bouncing back again. In terms of liminal space, because of this sensory fluctuation I was putting myself through going back and forth between the insane cramped layout of Japan and the United States' far more open layout and all of the individualism and collectivism each of the two impacted my perception of existence, nostalgia mixed with corrupted memories that gave way into nightmares, arguably the first liminal space that any of us ever experience. During COVID, when I was away from Japan longer than any other time I had since college, I had so many nightmares about it. But not just Japan for what is in real life, but what my collective memory tried to piece together my subconsciousness because I hadn't been back there to refresh my memories. Like I said, I don't know why, but it's actually really hard for me to recall a lot of detailed specifics when thinking back to my life on one side or the other. When I lived in Japan, it was hard for me to remember life in the US, and when I was in the US, it was hard for me to remember life in Japan. And after 4 years of being away from the country, my nostalgic memories of life in Japan had become pretty fragmented. So in my dreams, those confusing, tight, and winding roads turned into twisted lanes going nowhere, highways that lifted above the ground going through buildings with no structural reasoning. Train stations became literal mazes with dozens of overlapping, inscrutable signs lacking any ability to give direction. People packed into what looked like lockers more than trains, and each one of them with indiscernible faces. Nothing went anywhere. All there was another indiscernible sign, faceless body, doors opening into massive clusters of items and hallways, a surreal pocket of everything and nothing, trapped and lost. I even had nightmares about Komono, despite how small of a countryside town it is. Getting lost in the myriad of buildings and businesses, all indiscernible from each other. If you've ever seen Ralph Bakshi's Cool World, well, imagine that, only twisted Japanese architecture, and you'll get what I'm talking about. And this is another thing that makes Japan so liminal to me. It overloads my senses so much that not only do I feel lost in a pocket of isolated space and time, but those feelings from the past meld themselves into my dreams and nightmares, only further creating greater, more horrific locations of liminal space. There were even nightmares where I felt trapped between countries. During COVID, I had nightmare after nightmare about being stuck between getting off the plane that was from the US and trying to get in through Japanese customs. Maybe I didn't have the right kind of document, maybe I was flagged as some kind of threat. It didn't really matter the reason, the dreams just kept happening over and over again, and it was always the same thing. All I knew is that I was stuck. I had no way to get back home, and I couldn't get into Japan. And to make things worse, even these nightmares were fragmented memories of what I could recall when I was in the process of going to Japan or coming back home. Everything felt distorted, corrupted, twisted, and nightmarish. And again, these nightmares are of transitory helplessness and emptiness, unable to transition from one place to another, the same kind of terror when referring to true liminal horror. Now, at this point, I'm sure there's a lot of you asking me, why am I only talking about urban Japan? I mean, that only makes up one part of the country, right? And yeah, even though it makes up much of its population density, it doesn't make up for Japan's total landmass. So let's talk about that for a minute. There's a lot of Japan that is extremely rural and even wild. 70 to 80% of the entire country is mountainous forests that yield very few natural resources aside from maybe lumber. But in my mind, the fact that so much of Japan's topography is wild mountainous forests makes the country even more liminal, not less. Consider this. When we go on a walk down a forested nature path or even go camping in the woods to, quote, get away from it all, what does getting away from it all really mean? From my understanding, we venture into nature to disassociate ourselves from aspects of our life, our job, our house, the city we live in, but why does it make us feel better? I would argue because it takes us away from places that we identify so closely with that we need to remove ourselves from them and let ourselves exist in a natural liminal space. Being out in nature allows us to detach ourselves from the places that we identify with. Work, life at home, school, and all of the stresses and problems that those put in our lives. When we want to get away, we want to remove ourselves from those different kinds of identities. And when we look around to the trees, shrubs, rocks, and all of the different formations of nature, there's no real rhyme or reason to it. It merely just exists. I mean, maybe there are some trails or parks that have one or two defining features, but when we actually go out to camp, we're not going out there specifically to be around those landmarkers. We're there to disassociate. So if that's true, doesn't that mean that dense forested nature in itself is a liminal space? And if you're still not convinced, let me ask you this as well. If forests aren't liminal spaces that are devoid of identity, then why do they feature so prominently in horror? Getting lost in the woods, especially at night, is one of the oldest tropes of fear that exists. And why do we fear it? Because it's an unknown that completely lacks identity. Not only are forested areas dense with sprawling vegetation, it's incredibly difficult to navigate due to the lack of immediate identification. There's no intent or structure with forests, and the lack of those create a far, far greater liminal space than I think a lot of us realize. My point here is that nature, especially forests, are incredibly similar to what we understand about modern liminal spaces to be. And how much of it makes up Japan's topography? Again, 70 to 80%. It's hard to explain without experiencing it yourself, but when you get away from all the shrines, temples, and tourist traps in rural Japan, it can feel pleasantly disassociating at best and utterly terrifying at worst. Much like its urban liminal feel, rural Japan, especially at night, can feel just as liminal for the reasons that I mentioned above. And this is why I say Japan is a nation of liminality. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not completely everywhere, but it's something present enough that it's been nagging at my mind for over 10 years, with the most extreme cases showing up in the most liminal of all places to human perception, my dreams and nightmares. And I know I'm not the only one that thinks this. During the course of researching and really thinking about this video, I went on to r/liminal space and a couple other places of liminal space appreciation, and I was so surprised to see how many examples of liminal space there were in these communities that were from Japan. I can't sit here and rattle off exactly how many examples I found, but safe to say, there's a bunch of them. So I can't help but feel that the experiences I had weren't exactly wholly unique. That's why I want to ask all of you. For those of you who lived in Japan or even just visited, how did you feel the first time you were there? Did you or even do you feel some of the same liminal feelings that I described? I mean, I'm genuinely curious because for a long time I thought I was just crazy, so please let me know in the comments below. Also, again, if you want to get yourself my adorable little Ganuki that I use for VTubing, be sure to hop in the video description for a link on where to pick one up. Next time, I want to get away from all the psychological mind twisting and talk about something a little more grounded and a bit more silly. Samurai versus cowboys. A cultural comparison of two of the 18th century's biggest icons between the East and the West, and how these seemingly polar opposites have a lot more in common than you may realize. So if that sounds like a good time, sub up, get notified, and check back in a couple of weeks for a brand new video. And until then everyone, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.